WBIN 18 presents Debate Week. Brought to you by AARP New Hampshire. Tonight, the candidates for New Hampshire's 1st Congressional District debate. Now, live from the WBIN 18 studios, your moderator, Charlie Sherman.
Good evening, I'm Charlie Sherman, and welcome to the second in our WBIN Debate Week series. Tonight, it's our pleasure to welcome the Democrat and Republican candidates in the race for the 1st Congressional District of New Hampshire. Over the next hour, we'll focus on the issues that matter most to the citizens of New Hampshire. But first, the debate rules. Candidates will get 1 minute to respond to direct questions. 30-second rebuttals will be given as time allows. We'll be doing 2 rounds of questions in which candidates will have up to 60 seconds to respond. We'll also have questions from our debate sponsor, AARP New Hampshire, and some questions from New Hampshire voters that WBIN reporters have collected over the past week. Time permitting, we will also have a lightning round of questions where the candidates will have 30 seconds to answer those questions. The majority of the questions, however, will be posed by our distinguished panel of journalists. Tonight, that panel includes Howard Altschiller from the Portsmouth Herald, Clay Wirestone from the Concord Monitor, and WBIN 18 News Director Martin Morentz. Now, let's meet the candidates. First, Republican candidate Congressman Frank Ginta. Frank lives in Manchester. He is married with 2 children. He was the former mayor of the city of Manchester. And to the Democrat candidate is former Congresswoman Carol Shea-Porter. Carol lives in Rochester. She is married with 2 children. She is a social worker. Welcome all, and now let's get started. First up, a question from Howard Altschiller about taxes and spending.
First, good evening to both of you. And this question is for Ms. Shea-Porter. On January 1st, billions of dollars worth of budget cuts are scheduled to take effect. At the same time, the so-called Bush tax cuts are set to expire, raising tax rates on grounded staters. Experts say if this is allowed to happen all at once, our country will fall off a fiscal cliff, and we would go into a national recession. This all happened because Congress couldn't reach a deal on deficit reduction. What do we do about it?
Well, I think the 112th Congress needs to get back to work and fix this. They're the ones that passed that law, and so they have to deal with that. But I will say, looking into the future, that I do agree that we need to have tax cuts for everybody under the first $300,000. But after that, we have to allow those increased tax breaks to end. It was intended that way when the Bush tax cuts were put into place, and I think we need to return to the Clinton rate.
Congressman, you have 1 minute.
Thank you, Charlie. I want to quickly thank WBIN and AARP for hosting this debate. The fiscal cliff is a very serious situation. We in the House of Representatives have passed multiple solutions, both on the tax side as well as sequestration, extending all of the existing tax rates so we can give our small business owners, our entrepreneurs, our job creators the certainty that they need relative to tax policy. We've done that multiple times. We await action in the Senate, as well as we've done the same thing with sequestration. We have passed not once, but multiple times, a menu of options for the Senate to choose in terms of replacement cuts. This is so critical because you have economists on both sides of the aisle that agree if we don't get this accomplished, the country will further decline in terms of GDP growth and economic infusion, which is what we need.
Howard, you have a follow-up?
Mr. Ginta, Simpson Bowles proposed roughly $2 of spending cuts for every $1 of new revenue. Do you think this is about right? And if not, in which direction is it off?
Well, I applaud Simpson Bowles for putting forward a solution to try to deal with our deficit and our debt. We have $1.1 trillion in a current deficit, and we have $16 trillion in long-term debt. Unfortunately, the President of the United States didn't choose any of the ideas in Simpson Bowles to put forward in his budget. We in the House took 12 different ideas within Simpson Bowles, passed it in the House of Representatives. Once again, we await action by the Senate. But the challenge, Howard, is that Harry Reid, the Senate Majority Leader, has said he will not pass a budget last year or this year. So it's a tough thing to do when you don't have the Senate working the way the House has been working.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 30 seconds.
Yes, well, of course the Senate can't accept the House budget. The House budget slashes spending on Medicare, it slashes spending on health care, it slashes spending for Meals on Wheels and spending on education. The only thing that that budget does is make life much better for those who are already wealthy and continues the oil subsidies. And so they're not going to be able to accept a spending budget that comes from the House where they absolutely refuse to compromise. They gave them something that just was not acceptable, and that's what we're seeing.
Howard, you have one more follow.
Can I follow up on that, Howard?
30 seconds.
Okay, thank you very much. Here's the reality. We have passed two different budget proposals, one last year and one this year. We're not asking the Senate to pass our version. We are asking the Senate to adhere to the law, which says you've got to pass a budget by April 15th so we could have quote-unquote regular order in the House and the Senate, get a committee of conference, and pass a budget for the country. How in God's name can small business owners or anybody in this country predict what is going to transpire at the federal level when the Senate doesn't come to the table to try to deal with these important, significant issues?
Howard?
Ms. Shea-Porter, the military budget is approximately $700 billion this year. Experts say it would be virtually impossible to approach a balanced budget unless cuts in military spending are on the table. Where can we meaningfully reduce military spending beyond our planned withdrawal from Afghanistan?
Well, when I was on the Armed Services Committee for 4 years, we knew that you could not even audit the Pentagon budget. We actually had to say you need to get in shape to be audited by 2014. And so there are many, many programs that duplicate and triplicate themselves, and that's a good place to look. I understand that we have enemies all over the world and that we have to have a strong defense. But everybody also knows that we have weapons that are archaic. We know that we are not doing proper oversight for contractors. We have to change the way that we do business. And there's plenty of savings to be there and still maintain a strong military.
Clay?
Yes, so this is a question for Mr. Genta. Someone watching this debate right now is sitting at home unemployed. This person has been looking for a job for months, maybe years, without any success. They simply cannot get back into the workforce. What can you tell this person tonight from this debate stage about how you're going to help them?
Well, in my first term in Congress, Clay, one of the most important things I think I've done, not just on the legislative side, but right back here at home, I got something started calling Getting Granite Staters Back to Work. It was my own jobs initiative where we had 6 different jobs fairs all around the district. We had one specifically for veterans. We had one specifically for women. And the idea here was to be a connector, to use the office that I hold as a connector with employers who are seeking good employees and those who are either underemployed or unemployed to seek a job. And we've been able to help people right here in New Hampshire. But beyond that, we have a policy initiative that we've got to approach. We need to have a pro-growth economy. You need to have stability and predictability relative to economic policy from Washington, so our job creators, not just here in the Granite State, but all over the country, have the ability to plan and grow their businesses and start hiring people again. That's not happening because I think of the policies that have been put in place by this president and by my opponent's policies when she served in the House of Representatives as well.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 1 minute.
Well, actually, if you really want to help people, you should pass a comprehensive jobs bill, which they have failed to do. And also, we need to work more closely with community colleges to retrain people who do not have jobs right now. But it's simply not true what my opponent just said, because actually the unemployment rate is sitting at 7.8% because we did put in the Stimulus Act, which created jobs and held jobs and did a great deal of other things. The problem that we have right now is that the 112th Congress simply doesn't show up for work, and they are called the most unproductive Congress in history because they haven't passed anything that will help people either here in New Hampshire or across the country.
We have a follow-up from Clay Wirestone.
Ms.
Is it
Shea-Porter.
possible for me to respond to something that my opponent said?
For Ms. Shea-Porter.
After his question.
Yeah. Let's flip this equation, following up on jobs. There are business owners watching tonight who have jobs available for highly skilled and well-trained employees, but they can't find the right workers. They say the people available simply aren't qualified. Maybe they don't have time for retraining programs to kick in. What could you do in Congress to help them?
Well, continue what we actually were doing was to establish partnerships between community colleges and the individuals. One of the things I think we could do to help businesses and also help people to be trained is to offer businesses a tax credit for every person they take in and train. So there's on-the-job training, but we do have to also step it up on the technology. One of the problems that we're having is we've fallen behind in this country for research technology, and we simply have to introduce that into the high schools to make these young people educated and able to launch into careers.
Mr. Ginter, you have 30 seconds.
Well, first, we did support in the House and get passed and signed into law by the President a comprehensive jobs bill back in April of this year. We've also passed over 30 different jobs-related pieces of legislation in the House, many of which were supported bipartisanly that await action in the Senate. What I think my opponent is talking about is more of the same. $800 billion stimulus that she voted for, that the President claims was working, that produced 43 months of unemployment above 8% in this country. I don't think anybody feels that that is good enough. When you have 23 million people who are underemployed or unemployed, that's a problem in this country, and we need a different recipe, a different solution for the challenges we have.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 30 seconds.
Well, actually, my opponent went to the Manchester airport when they used the stimulus money to build the access road and stood there and said how wonderful this was and how it was going to bring jobs to the area and tourism and how it was an example of what happens when we work together. So I think that Frank Ginter was right when he said that that stimulus money was a very good project, and putting it into the Manchester airport and elsewhere around the state was a good thing and saved jobs and created jobs.
Mr. Ginter, you have 30 seconds if you'd like to.
I went to that event for my good friend Ray Wazork, who is a leader in this city, who is a leader in our state. The governor was there praising Ray Wazork as well. Republicans and Democrats were there praising Ray Wazork for his leadership to get the airport to where it is today. And many mayors in Manchester, myself included, continued the investment in the airport. But back to what my opponent truly wants. She wants a borrowed from China policy that has another stimulus equal to or more than the $800 billion that was already spent. And what did that produce? 8% unemployment for 43 consecutive months.
Did you want to rebuttal?
I do. It's pretty amazing because they haven't passed a comprehensive jobs bill, and the former head of the OMB under Reagan said that just calling it a jobs bill doesn't make it a jobs bill, and saying that if you get deregulation out of the way, it will create jobs. It doesn't. And the reality is that there has not been a comprehensive jobs bill since the 112th Congress started, and there's a reason that they're being called the most unproductive Congress ever.
We have to move on. For our next question, we go to WBIN News Director Martin Morenz, and this question is for Ms. Shea-Porter.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you're both proud of your work on behalf of our veterans. And as we've seen from the back-and-forth accusations on TV ads, you're also attacking each other over what you have or have not done for veterans. Specifically, what are the differences in performance here between the two of you on veterans issues?
Well, our Congress passed a great deal of legislation. I'm very proud to say that we passed a new GI Bill of Rights, so we have combat veterans who can now go to college or have a family member go. I'm proud that we put more money in the VA than before in history because the backlog was so terrible, and I'm very proud of the fact that I was able to stop the burn pits that were affecting our combat troops and making them ill. And I'm also proud of the fact that I put in the bill to try to get a VA hospital or equivalent in-state care, and was able to get a contract with Concord Hospital and build onto the clinics at the VA. So I know that in this Congress there has been very little action, and actually they did try to take the money out for a program called VASH, which is Veterans Affairs Housing for the Homeless, and it's a very important program, and they slashed all the funding. They did put it back in after protest, but they slashed the funding for that, and they also failed to put money in for PTSD and for patients who were suicidal. They had a chance and didn't do it.
Mr. Ginter, you have 1 minute.
Well, I'm glad you bring this up, Martin, because a group of 40 veterans in our state had a press conference because they were very frustrated with and very disappointed, quite frankly, in my opponent's attack ad, trying to claim that I cut billions from veterans. Nothing could be farther from the truth. We actually increased the funding by $8 billion She refers to something called an MTR, a procedural motion, a motion to recommit back to committee, which is a political stunt. You dispense with that political stunt, and we had a 411-5 vote for the bill that she's referencing, H.R. 2055. Not one Democrat in the House of Representatives voted against that bill. And the President of the United States signed it into law, championing it as a strong veterans bill. So I would ask my opponent, would she have been the only Democrat in the House of Representatives to vote against that legislation?
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 30 seconds.
Well, I'd like to say it was not an amendment to send it back to committee. It was an amendment that amended the bill and then could go forward right there. So that actually, well, there's two kinds, as you know. So that simply is not so. The other thing is that, yes, he did have some veterans in a park. And if you look them up, you would see they were also on the Ovid for Governor Committee and others. And so I respect everybody's service, but we're not just veterans or spouses of veterans, as I am. We also have political leanings. And so I'm not surprised that you could gather, I think, about 25 people. I was surprised that you weren't there. I thought that was unusual. But I understand that there are people who can think differently, and I totally respect that.
Mr. Ginter, you have 30
I'd
seconds.
like to know if you would be the only Democrat to vote against the bill that you're attacking me for, H.R. 2055. Would you have been the only Democrat to vote against it?
Do you know, Mr. Ginta, we need a fact check for that first.
It's H.R. 2055, 411-5.
We would have
no
to have-
Democrat voted in the House against that bill, and the President signed it into law. Would you have voted against that bill?
Well, of course I'm going to support what the President introduces. If you're talking about a much smaller veterans bill, which I believe you are.
Talking about the bill that he signed into law, H.R. 2055, that was passed in the House, 411-5. Would you have voted against that bill?
No, of course I would not have.
So you're
Of course
attacking
not.
me for H.R. 2055, my vote on it, yet you would have voted for the same bill.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about adding an amendment, and I think that you know the difference there.
Okay.
All right, we have to move on. As we mentioned at the top of the show, we did solicit some questions from voters across New Hampshire. Let's hear from one of those folks. Jordy is a voter in the city of Portsmouth.
My name is Jordy King, and my question is, what are you going to do to help commercial fishermen in New Hampshire?
We begin with Ms. Shea-Porter. You have 1 minute.
Well, I am very happy that of the recent decisions that have been made, and I'm absolutely delighted that we now have a new person who's in charge and understands being a fisherman himself and understanding what it's like. So we know that we have to find the strategic balance between helping the fishermen and making sure also that there's stock there. So I know it's been a very difficult relationship. It does seem to be improving, and I would continue to work on that along with colleagues across the aisle as we did before. And my understanding is that Congressman Ginta has also worked carefully with them. It's one of the good things I think about New England, that we are able to talk to each other across the aisle and that our staffs are able to find a way through to help the fishermen and to help other groups that are affected through no fault of their own by changes in the environment or changes in fish stock or whatever it is. Seeing us work together makes me feel very, very happy and hopeful that there'll be more solutions coming.
Mr. Ginter, you have 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. King, for the question. This is an important issue for New Hampshire. $17 million of economic benefit come directly from the fishing industry in New Hampshire. We're begging for help against this administration. So this is an example not only where I stood up for the fishing industry in working with them on catch shares, working with them on issues that are so important to them in terms of the time that they can fish, but I also worked across the aisle with Barney Frank to make this a particularly bipartisan issue so we could help the fishing industry, so we could ensure that people on the seacoast have jobs, not just now, but in the future. And I'm going to continue to work with the fishing industry here in New Hampshire, and I'll continue to work with whoever replaces Barney Frank in his new congressional district as he retires.
We're going to go back to our panel and a question from Howard Altschuler of the Portsmouth Herald.
And this is for Mr. Ginta. You have voted repeatedly to repeal the Affordable Care Act. According to the nonpartisan Kaiser Family Health Foundation, if Obamacare is repealed, Medicare spending would increase by $716 billion. Medicare's hospital trust fund would be projected to be insolvent in 4 years, and many people could see increases in both premiums and costs for services. Is that a risk you are willing to take?
Well, the Kaiser Foundation also in that same report cites $2,200 increase in premiums per family, an average increase of $2,200 for premiums. The President of the United States said by this point the average premium would have decreased by $2,500. So I'm glad that you bring up the Kaiser study, because there's a lot in that study that also suggests the Affordable Care Act is not good for America. Now let's also move to, what do New Hampshire residents want? They continually oppose the Affordable Care Act. There are better, stronger alternatives to ensure that we have greater accessibility and greater affordability. Two of the goals that the president set out to achieve, but I think failed miserably. This is a piece of legislation that my opponent supports and continues to support, despite the fact that people in New Hampshire do not support it. And part of your job as a representative is to listen to your constituents. So what can we do? You know, I'm sure we'll get into that in the next phase of this question. But I will tell you, we need to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and we need to put in sensible solutions to make better access and greater affordability.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 1 minute.
Well, I appreciate the fact that Mr. Ginter said listen to his constituents, and we do understand that this was an area where there was a lot of conflict. But I think just talking to the Tea Party and talking to the Glenn Beck 912 group is not going to give you an accurate idea of what other people think. For example, the American Medical Association, the nurses, and pretty much every group, the pediatricians and all the others, did support this, and so did people in New Hampshire. So it wasn't just a very clear line there. So what do we like about the Affordable Care Act? The fact that we have pre-existing conditions out now. We keep children under the age of 26 in. We make sure that people don't lose their homes anymore because they can't be kicked off a policy because they've been sick longer. For Medicare recipients, we're closing the donut hole, and I was very proud to take an active role in that. So it reduces the price of their prescriptions. They have free preventive care. We also have a grant now that's come into the state of New Hampshire that will help seniors stay in their homes instead of having to go to nursing homes. So there's so much good in this bill, and we'll continue to work on that. But this was a good bill, and the problem was that people were frightened initially when they were told there were death panels, which was not accurate.
We do have a follow-up question from Mr. Altshuler.
Mr. Ginter, you actually anticipated this follow-up question. If you succeed in repealing Obamacare, what specifically would you offer in its place?
So first, I want to go back to what my opponent said. Look, it's not just about special interest groups, which she rattled off about who should be in favor or opposed of this piece of legislation. We're actually supposed to listen to our voting constituents and the constituents that we represent. And overwhelmingly, they continue to oppose this, and the public surveys show that. So let's try to work on something that actually makes sense. The first thing that we need to do is focus on transparency. Health insurance, health care, is the only thing that we purchase where we don't know the price. You think about this. When you go grocery shopping, when you go to a restaurant, when you get your car repaired, you know what the cost is of those items. But if you get an MRI, you don't know what the cost is. Transparency is the solution to this problem. And I'll give you an extended answer as to what we did when I was mayor of Manchester my last year. We went to the 17 unions in the city, and we said, if we, not legislatively, but allow you voluntarily to choose the most expensive or least expensive, but you get a cut in the savings, will you accept? We saved $40,000 in week 1 because of transparency.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 1 minute.
Yes, he does seem to be calling for a lot of governmental regulation when he talks about finding out how much the prices are.
Said it was voluntary.
But I think what is good about all of this is that it's clear that they've had 2 years to put some policy forward, and they haven't. And the reason for that, they used to say repeal and replace, and they just stopped saying replace because they actually don't have any plan to replace this. And what you indicated about controlling the cost and knowing how much everything would cost could and will be available in the state exchanges, where they'll actually be able to go.
Cost. I'm talking about providing information to the consumer.
You'll have your chance, Mr. Ginter. Please let Ms. Shea-Porter finish.
Thank you. So I think what we'll have to see is when people go into the exchanges and they'll be able to compare prices. This is all private insurance, but they will have to be able to compare prices and services, and people will be able to make a better consumer decision. So I believe that this is going to be an excellent program. It's already proving that it's driving down costs. We have had a lower rate of increase since the health care law was passed.
Mr. Ginter, you have 30 seconds.
The very citation from Howard, the Kaiser Foundation, that study states that it went up $2,200 when the President of the United States said that this specific bill, the one that you supported, would actually decrease by $2,500 per family. That is a huge swing. And in this economy, when people are out of work, when people are struggling with gas prices, when people are struggling with home heating oil, you want to add another $2,500 to that average family. And to the national debt, it's $1.8 trillion now, according to the new CCBO projection, which was based on a Senate request after the Supreme Court made their decision. So now we're talking about $1.8 trillion for the country and $2,200 more per family. Why would you support such a notion?
We have to move on. Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 30 seconds.
Well, actually, the prices have not gone up. The cost of premiums have gone
The Kaiser
down.
Foundation
So
stated it.
they have not gone up. The prices actually have had the smallest increase, much smaller than they were. We know that over the past decade that the cost of health insurance has been absolutely soaring. And so in the past year, they actually have had a much slower rate of growth, and it's being attributed to the health care plan.
We do have to move on. We have a question now from an AARP New Hampshire member, Alan Cohen. He asks, how would you protect Social Security for today's seniors and strengthen it for future generations? Mr. Ginter, you have 1 minute.
Well, thank you, Mr. Cohen, for the question. I think of the three big programs on the mandatory spending side, Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security is probably the easiest to fix. First, the trustee of Social Security states that if nothing is done by 2033, this will be insolvent. So when I come home and I talk to people at town hall meetings, do you want us to try to solve the problem? The answer is yes. We all agree on that. The challenge is, how do we do it? So we should not make any changes for Social Security, or for that matter, Medicare as well, for anyone who's 55 and older. People have focused their retirement in that age group, knowing that Social Security, Medicare will be there for them. We're not going to make any changes. Relative to the future generations, someone who's my age or younger, we will probably have a bipartisan agreement on the table that puts everything on the table to try to figure out what is the best way we can move this through Congress, but I suspect that will happen in this next Congress.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 1 minute.
Well, I'm very certain that a bipartisan agreement to do what you said will never happen. You were rated on by a group called On the Issues that you strongly support privatizing Social Security based on a form that you filled out in 2010.
What group
and
is this?
It's called On the Issues. And what I really understand, having grown up in 3 generations of family members, is how much people need and rely on Social Security. Things happen along the way, illnesses, death, all kinds of tragedies, economic disaster. And so you need Social Security to provide that floor so that people will be supported and they can be certain that they'll at least be able to pay the rent and pay for their food. The reason they put Social Security into place originally was because seniors were in such terrible shape. We simply have to have Social Security. And we can do that by doing what Ronald Reagan did and others have done, which is tweak it. We can raise the cap. Right now it sits at $110,000. People pay taxes only up to $110,000, and then if you earn $200,000, you don't have to. So we can fix it, and we will.
We have to take a break. Please stay with us. We will be right back with more of the WBIN 18 First Congressional District Debate. Welcome back to the WBIN First Congressional District Debate. Another question now coming up from an AARP member, Sherry Harden. She asks, as health care costs rise and the cost of Medicare increases, how do you propose improving funding for Medicare? We start with Ms. Shea-Porter.
Well, first of all, we know that we need to do a better job controlling the costs of Medicare. And we know that there's still waste and fraud and inefficiency there. So that's going to be a big target. But the second part is the preventive care. We know that if we do not provide preventive care and people arrive at the age for Medicare, and they have diabetes or they have other illnesses, that this really does drive up the cost. So the emphasis coming through the healthcare law is going to be prevention to keep that down. And I'm sure that we'll have to keep tweaking that. But when you look at the benefits that people receive and recognize that this is the healthiest senior generation in our history, and it's because of Medicare. Before they put Medicare in almost 50 years ago, more than half of seniors did not have health insurance. So we have to continue this program. What is the option? There is not an option. To privatize it, to turn it over to a voucher program like my opponent would like to do, would be just wrong. So we will tweak it, and we will be more responsive, and we'll work hard at controlling costs and keeping people healthy.
Mr. Ginter, you have 1 minute.
Well, I don't think tweaking solves the problem with a program on the Medicare side, on the mandatory side, that is as large as Medicare. The trustees have said that this goes bankrupt in 12 years. That is right around the corner for a lot of people. So we have got to do something. What we have proposed, not once but twice, in the House, and bipartisanly I might add, is either giving you the option of traditional Medicare, or if you are under 55, so anyone who's 55 and older would be exempt and would stay on traditional Medicare. For anyone under that age, you can either choose traditional Medicare or a program that we put together with Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, who really, I think, boldly moved forward with an idea that we adopted in the House that said you can go to something called premium support. It's not a voucher program. A voucher is a check sent to an individual. That is not this. A check is sent on behalf of you to the federal government to pay for your choices and your options that you get to choose from a body of carriers that are trying to get your business. That's what lowers the cost down.
We're going to move on to our panel, and the next question is from Clay Wirestone of the Concord Monitor.
Ms. Shea-Porter, the recent attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, Libya, and the death of our ambassador there, Chris Stevens, shows how tensions are rising across the post-Arab Spring Middle East. Are we in danger of seeing the situation in the region spiral out of control? What steps do we need to take to restore peace?
Well, it certainly is a very tense area right now, and I'm absolutely delighted that we have Secretary of State Clinton at the helm of the State Department, and I have every confidence that the study that they're doing right now, looking to see what needs to be done, will be very fruitful. However, we do have to continue working with those countries in that region there. It's up to them, as well as us and other nations, to provide that stability. We do have to make sure that we hold them to the standards of protecting our men and women who are serving them and serving our country there. That was an absolute outrage. But I think that we need to recognize that most people in that region are really, really working hard for democracy. Libya is an example of people who have tried very hard, and they have apologized. It's an outrage that it happened. We need to beef up the security, but we can't have a knee-jerk reaction either. We need to recognize that for democracy to flourish, it's going to be a bumpy road there.
Mr. Ginter, you have 1 minute.
Charlie, I wouldn't call the death of 4 Americans a bumpy road, nor would I call the death of an ambassador who represents the President of the United States a quote-unquote bumpy road. I think that does a disservice. I think it does a disservice to our Americans, to our President, and to what we are trying to accomplish around the world. The reality is that there was a failure in security. It's one that should never have happened. This President should be immediately have handled this in a much different way. And I would tell you that the most effective way is for our own people securing our own people, particularly our ambassadors. We found out just this evening, because of a hearing that's going to transpire tomorrow in Washington, that the State Department has finally revealed this was a terrorist attack. It took the administration how long? It took the Secretary of State how long to actually admit the truth that this was a terrorist attack? You know, people are so upset about this, and you make it sound like it's just a bump in the road, and I think that that is disappointing and it's wrong.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 30-second rebuttal.
I have to say, I'm so offended, and I thought you would be able to do this in a bipartisan manner. I said democracy, not the disaster that befell our our ambassador. I said, democracy is messy and there are bumps in the road. But this has nothing to do with the ambassador. I'm sure I was quite clear saying what a great tragedy this is. It's a terrible tragedy. And I was on the Armed Services Committee for 4 years. So I recognize that this is a failure, an absolute failure in our safety and our protection, our plans that we have for our ambassador. So please, let's not make this a personal thing. This is a terrible tragedy.
Okay, we have to move on. Howard Altschuler of the Portsmouth Herald with the next question.
It's a question for Mr. Ginta. Our environmental reporter, Deborah McDermott, says she's hearing complaints from business owners of all political stripes that the lack of a national energy policy is hindering their decision-making ability. Would you support a bill calling for a national energy policy, and if so, what would be some of the big ideas?
Yeah, I've co-sponsored a bill that is an all-of-the-above energy policy for the nation. There's a number of things we need to do. First, I wouldn't support what my opponent did in supporting a national energy tax. That is just going to add to the challenge that we already have, that small business owners and large business owners have right here in New Hampshire. We need to do a number of things. First, the President of the United States does need to allow for the Keystone Pipeline. He needs to allow that permit to go forward. There were particular issues that have been worked out, particularly in Nebraska, in the aquifer of Nebraska. That has been resolved. That was the only real pending problem to stopping that, the president from allowing that pipeline to continue. You're talking about a multi-billion-dollar operation. You're talking about 20,000 jobs immediately just on that one pipeline. In addition to that, we are using 19 million barrels a day of oil here in the United States, but we're only producing 7 million. So there's two things we can do: conservation, but also explore for more, bring the price of oil down, bring the price of gasoline down.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 1 minute.
Well, we've actually been exporting energy this year. It's an interesting change there. But I have to say that my opponent not only believes in the oil subsidies, but he also said that if they took the oil subsidies away, then the big 5 oil companies should have free leases on public land. Our oil, our land, but it wouldn't cost the oil companies anything. So that's not a way to solve an energy crisis. The way to solve an energy crisis is all of the above, but it means a heavy investment in renewables as well. It means that we have to take this seriously, just like China does, just like the Department of Defense does. They already are experimenting with alternative fuels. So yes, we can use gas and we can use oil. We don't have a choice at this point. But looking into our future, we should start an Apollo-type program now that will make us energy efficient and free from being in areas where our enemies are. Why would we be enriching our enemies being dependent on their oil? It is time for an investment in renewable energy and a new energy program.
Mr. Ginter, you have a 30-second rebuttal.
We don't want to be like China. I mean, my opponent said we should be like China. I don't want to be like China. America doesn't want to be like China when it comes to energy policy. We need to be energy independent. So what does that mean? We have greater exploration in this country. The leases that the president can provide and agree to, he needs to do it immediately. We also need to focus on renewables and alternatives. The reality is that's about 15%. So you still have to find a way to get the fossil fuel cost down. And the best way to do that is to have greater supply. With 19 million barrels a day that we're using and only 7 million that we're producing, at $3.85 a gallon at the pump, most Americans are demanding exploration in this country now.
We have to move on. Martin Morenz of WBIN News has the next question.
Ms. Shea-Porter, over the past 2 years, the tone in Washington has grown increasingly polarized. Do you blame the Tea Party for the gridlock? And if elected, how will you work to make Congress more productive?
It has gotten a lot worse, and the 112th Congress is absolutely gridlocked. It's been difficult for a number of years, but this has been the worst. And yes, it is the Tea Party. It's Frank Ginta and his colleagues who went down there. There's actually a book called It's Worse Than It Looks, and it's written by a Republican and a Democrat, one from the American Enterprise Institute, which is a conservative institute, and the other one by the Brookings Institute. And what they're saying is that because the politicians that were sent down in 2010 are so ideologically locked in cement, won't compromise, won't trust science, won't work at all, we're seeing that. So I believe there will be a change, and I will reach across the aisle and work with people. I did before. We can do this. I come from a Republican family. They are not the enemy. The problem is that we have a very right-wing group in Washington right now that will not compromise.
Mr. Ginter, you have 1 minute.
Well, there's a lot that my opponent just said. First, she blames the Tea Party. Yet a month ago on a different TV station, she found herself agreeing with the Tea Party and said that she agrees with many different principles of the Tea Party. So you can't have it both ways. Secondly, this freshman class was elected around the country because the Congress you served in was spending and borrowing out of control and passing legislation that the country didn't want. The country said enough in 2010. So here's what we've done in the House. The first thing we did was cut our own budgets. The second thing we did was vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act, something that the country wanted us to do. The third thing we did was stop earmarks. The fourth thing we did was freeze congressional pay. And then we went into the bipartisan work of the more than 30 different jobs-related bills that we passed, many of which bipartisanly, that were sent to the Senate. Most of these bills are stuck in the Senate. Harry Reid, the majority leader, continues to claim he will not vote on these bills, he will not vote on a budget, he will not get to regular order. I think it's more than just the Republicans in the House. I think it's a problem in the Senate.
We have a follow-up for Carol Shea-Porter from Martin Morenz.
Shea-Porter, can you name two people from the other you've worked with in Congress and what you have accomplished with them?
Yes, I can.
30 seconds.
I hesitate because I don't want to, cause him any great harm, but actually on the Education Labor Committee, one is already gone because he was a moderate Republican, Mike Castle, and we worked together on legislation, Education Labor Committee, and Jason Chaffetz and I actually supported a bill together as well. So yes, there can be some compromise and there can be some improvement down there. I just, finish?
Yes.
Okay.
Mr. Ginter, the same question.
Sure. Well, just regionally, I've worked with Mike Michaud up in Maine. I've worked with Peter Welch in Vermont on transportation issues. Mike Michaud in Maine, I've worked on LIHEAP bill, and with Barney Frank in Massachusetts on fisheries issues, because people in New Hampshire and the region have understood that it is important to focus on a bipartisan approach, particularly when it comes to the region. So, I spent a lot of time, not just in committee, but on the floor on different votes, making sure that we had the best interest of New Hampshire at heart, and we worked with all bordering states and all different members from those states.
We're going to go out on the street again to another question from another Granite State voter. This is from Rose in Dover.
Hello, I'm Rose Fasillo, and I'd like to know, would you keep the home mortgage tax deduction?
Mr. Ginter?
Thank you very much, Ms. Fasillo, for the question. We're going to have comprehensive tax reform hopefully in the next Congress. In this current Congress, we focused on extending all of the existing tax rates, but I think what you can do is protect the home interest mortgage deduction for those families that need it, but higher income families, second homes, you can over time find a way to phase it out. That is a bipartisan discussion right now in the Ways and Means Committee, and we anticipate that we'll have a reform in place next year. But for those at a certain income level who require that home interest deduction, it will be preserved.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 1 minute.
Well, that's an interesting answer, but I have to say that the congressman has supported a flat tax, which would mean that there would not be the home mortgage deduction. And in the Ryan budget, that also appears to be under threat because there's simply no way they can make the arithmetic add up and still offer those mortgage deductions because of the amount of money that they will be giving to millionaires. About $265,000 will come to millionaires, and they have to figure out a way to make that up somehow. And so it's very, very worrisome. But there's been talk that what they would have to do is go after the mortgage deduction. I would support that mortgage deduction. I think the middle class depends on that. That's how they get their homes. That's how they keep their homes, and I think it's essential.
Thank you. We're going to go back to our panel.
I would just like to respond to that because the Budget Committee does not set tax policy, and my opponent should know that. She served in Congress for 4 years. The Ways and Means Committee sets tax policy. So the Budget Committee does not have jurisdiction over it. You can't make the accusation that there's something in the budget proposal in Budget Committee that eliminates the deduction. It's simply not true.
Ms. Shea-Porter, if you'd like 30 seconds.
Well, the congressman was on the Budget Committee, and so he certainly knows what goes through that Budget Committee, and then he voted for the Ryan budget. He voted for it a couple of times. So it's pretty clear that you cannot give these big tax breaks and then also have all of the deductions for the middle class. And I'm not making that up. I mean, that's just how it is.
And now we're going to go, we have to go back to our
exists?
panel. Our next question is from Howard Altschiller of the Portsmouth Herald.
And this is a question for Mr. Ginta. You supported a failed bill that would have amended clean water laws and limited the authority of the EPA to impose water quality standards. You've also sided with several seacoast communities that are fighting the EPA over nitrogen emission levels from wastewater treatment plants into Great Bay. Why do you believe the EPA needs to have its authority limited?
Well, I think in this case, the EPA needs their authority limited for several reasons. Number one, they are overreaching into the contiguous communities of Great Bay. The contiguous communities came to me and said, we desperately need your help. The EPA is mandating through what they claim is logical science, but what the communities have said is failed science, that the nitrogen levels would go down to 3 milliliters per liter. So what I did was, being a connector, worked with the EPA, worked with the contiguous communities to try to find a middle ground, which is, I think, 8 milliliters per liter, which everyone seems to think is reasonable. Nobody wants to see Great Bay dirty, including the contiguous communities. But even the mayor of Rochester testified at a public hearing that we had here in New Hampshire that this mandate from the EPA would cost the contiguous communities $250 million, which is wrong. And after I led on this issue, I was able to get Jeanne Shaheen and Governor Lynch both supporting the actions that I took.
Howard has a follow to that.
This is for Ms. Shea-Porter. Do you think the EPA is abusing its power?
Well, no, I don't. I think there was room for compromise there, but I have to say that Congressman Ginta's mission has been to abolish the EPA. He has stated that many times. He just voted for the Stop the War on Coal Act, and you can figure out what that actually means, and I say, and Start the War on Lungs Act. He has voted to allow polluters to keep in cement, to keep mercury. So he's pretty much removed any kinds of protections that we've had in our water and our air. Luckily, he has not been able, they've gotten it through the House, but they have not been able to get it through the Senate. But the environment is severely under attack. He has a 0 from the Sierra Club, and Frank Ginta has very, very low scores on pretty much the things that most of us care about. And why does this matter? Well, think about who started the EPA. It was President Nixon, because they used to be able to work in a bipartisan way to protect the environment. And now we've turned very hard right, and this is what we're seeing.
Mr. Ginta, you have 30
Howard,
seconds for
This is
rebuttal.
about Great Bay. This is about communities like Portsmouth and Rochester and what they're asking from their representative. I'm not sure that when my opponent was serving as the representative, that she actually even listened to the issues of the communities, of the contiguous communities, one of which she lives in. But when you have the mayor of Rochester who comes to you and says, we need relief, we want to work with the EPA, Congressman, we need your help. That's what I provided. Leadership in working with the communities and the EPA to find common ground for the long-term benefit of Great Bay.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 30 seconds.
Thank you. Actually, I did meet with them, and I met with a number, and we talked about all the ways to try to make
Did
the
you do anything
Bay.
about it?
Well, certainly, we've been working on that. The whole point, though, is that you have to believe in this. You have to believe that there's a government role, and I think that there's a tremendous difference between you and me on that issue. So compromise always, and try to work together. But when you start off wanting to abolish the EPA, and when you're voting for bills like Stop the War on Coal Act, then it gives an understanding of where the differences between us are. And I'm very proud to say that I'm an environmentalist. I believe in protecting the environment and working with the communities.
We're going to move on. Clay Wirestone from the Concord Monitor.
Yes, Ms. Shea-Porter, after 11 years of fighting in Afghanistan, the 11th anniversary was just a couple of days ago, and more than 2,000 American lives lost, not to mention many thousands of Afghan lives. What have we accomplished there as U.S. troops begin their final withdrawal?
I was in Afghanistan twice. I led a delegation in July 2010 to talk to Karzai about some of the abuses there. And before that, before I took my first trip, I said that we were right to go and take out the training camps. The terrorist training camps were there, and we had a right and an obligation to remove them. But after I went the first time, I realized that we were not going to be able to rebuild a country that had never been built. We couldn't help a country that had such tremendous illiteracy and so much violence inside their own borders and didn't even recognize a central government. So our troops have done everything they could. The men and women I saw there were just remarkable. But it is way past time to bring them home. It's a mission that is an unfair mission because they're not able to accomplish the goal. They kept moving the goalpost about what we hope to do. Taking out the terrorist training camps, yes. Having a light footprint so we can catch the terrorists that do come through, yes. But having troops on the ground like that, no.
Mr. Ginter, 1 minute.
Yeah, I also went to Afghanistan last December. And I am truly amazed at how our troops have served our country and have protected our freedoms and our liberties. And I think moving forward, what we need is to have an assurance of a group of American troops that will keep the fight of terrorist activity away from America. And unfortunately, the only way we can do that is to have some assets in that region. And that is an unfortunate reality. But the notion of spending billions of dollars on nation building in a country that doesn't seem to want that activity is something that we should be looking at in the next 10-year window of our budgeting and how we actually expend those dollars. That was the purpose of our trip. And as a result, we have reduced the long-term funding for that component of the mission.
For our final question, Martin Morenz.
We started tonight with a debate over the financial fiscal cliff, but we recently have seen a lighthearted exchange because of the presidential debate over the future of Big Bird. So what do you say? Do we throw Big Bird off the fiscal cliff, or how would you vote on cutting funding to PBS?
That's to Mr. Ginter.
Thank you very much. Look, you know, it's interesting. I watched that debate the other evening, and I think the reason that the president is talking about Big Bird is because he did not have a good debate, let's face it. But the reality is we've got big issues to deal with, big issues to solve for America. I believe that New Hampshire Public Radio, New Hampshire Public TV feel very, very strongly that they can do this on their own. And they mention it. They state it. So as the president, Governor Romney talked about, let's start looking at the budget in the sense of, are we going to borrow money for every single program? You know, I was a mayor. I prioritized. You've got to make tough decisions. Hopefully the economy comes back and those decisions become easier and easier for future Congress.
Ms. Shea-Porter, you have 1 minute.
Well, I know that Congressman Ginter said that he wanted to take all funding away from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And there are millions of children around the country whose parents are able to be confident that their children are learning ABCs and how to get along, and that it's a safe place for them to watch. And it also enriches our lives in so many ways. And it's interesting to me that my opponent would like to give the leases for free, which would cost billions of dollars to the American economy, and yet is going basically after public television. It just doesn't make any sense at all. If they wish to cut the budget, and they should, they have not done it, and they should do a better job, but if they're going to do that, then they need to concentrate on all of the tax advantages they're giving to the very wealthy.
It is time for our closing statements. We had a coin toss earlier. Ms. Shea-Porter was the winner. Mr. Ginter, you go first. Ms. Shea-Porter will go last.
Well, I want to thank Charlie Sherman for moderating the debate. I want to thank Howard and Clay and Martin for being our panelists. I want to thank WBIN and AARP for hosting this debate. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask for your vote on November 6th because we couldn't have a clearer option for who is going to serve you in the House of Representatives. Back in 2010, we as New Hampshire Granite Staters replaced my opponent because she was spending. She borrowed money. She focused on voting for things like the $800 billion stimulus. She voted for the national energy tax. These are things that are not consistent with New Hampshire values and New Hampshire needs. I take my business experience and I take my executive experience and my legislative experience to Washington to support New Hampshire Granite Staters in bringing our economy back to where it needs to be. And I ask for your vote on November 6th.
Ms. Shea-Porter, 1 minute.
Well, actually, we haven't been spending. The Wall Street Journal actually gave a report that the amount of spending under the Obama administration and the time that I was there was the slowest rate of growth. Even, they said, even hapless Hoover spent more money and the growth was larger. So that's not true. But the reason I'm in this whole situation here, running again for Congress, is because this country has turned in the wrong direction. This country has turned away from the middle class and forgot what made us great. It's not fair anymore, and people understand that they're not getting the same opportunity. It's time for this country to dream big again and to believe in the middle class and to bring people forward into the middle class. We need to educate our children. We need to rebuild our infrastructure, communication and our transportation infrastructure. We have to take care of our older people, and we have to make sure we all have an opportunity to succeed. This election is about fairness, this election is about opportunity, and this election is about who will have the sight and the vision to go forward, and I ask for your vote.
On behalf of our sponsor, AARP New Hampshire and WBIN 18, we'd like to thank the candidates and you, our viewing audience, for joining us for this evening's debate. Please come back again tomorrow night at 8 o'clock when the candidates for New Hampshire's 2nd Congressional District, Republican Congressman Charlie Bass and Democrat Ann Custer, meet to debate right here on WBIN 18. Good night, everybody.